वेलकम टू बियॉन्ड द ब्लू चैट्स। बियॉन्ड द ब्लू चैट्स में आपका स्वागत है और आज मैं बहुत खुश हूँ कि मेरे साथ है तेजस्वी। वेलकम तेजस्वी, थैंक यू सो मच फॉर टेकिंग द टाइम टू बी हियर।
Thank you so much, Gopika. I'm happy to be here.
ओके ग्रेट। सो थोड़ा सा तेजस्वी के बारे में। तेजस्वी एक डिजिटल कंटेंट एडिटर है गेसी के साथ और दे आर अ जर्नलिस्ट, रिसर्चर एंड फैसिलिटेटर whose attention is captured by human relationships at a time of the internet of things. And as an autistic person, उनके special interest है pleasure, public health, freedom of to love, connect, and relate beyond the ideas of wrong and right. And so, thank you so much, Tejaswi, for taking out the time and being here with me. So the first
My
thing
pleasure.
that I want to ask you is कि ये जो term neuroqueer है, उसका जो टर्म है, कॉन्सेप्ट है, आप प्लीज थोड़ा सा बता सकते हैं उसके बारे में?
Yeah. So neuroqueer basically suggests that some person who is neurodivergent or neuroatypical often does not see gender and sexuality or often doesn't see themselves as fitting gender and sexuality buckets at the way it is seen around in the world. For instance, when it comes to gender, we usually see the norm is there is a gender binary. There is a man and a woman, and
Right.
you pick either side and you define your identity based on it. But a lot of neuroqueer people might see this as a social construct that they don't necessarily relate to, or they might question whether they fit neatly into that gender binary. Similarly, with sexuality, similarly with dealing with relationships, there is a queerness with which they approach relationships. They might not necessarily, um, you know, we might not necessarily agree with the hierarchy as how a marital relationship needs to be a romantic relationship, and that's a pinnacle of a relationship that you can have with another person beyond your family and things like that. So they might see relationships and gender in a more diverse way. So in that sense, they are queer, and it
Okay.
kind of arises out of their neurodivergence.
Okay, fine. So that's very, very clear. So, when we were talking earlier, you had said that, a lot of your autistic self and your non-binary self, starting from your childhood, when we were talking, you had told me, kind of intersect.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think especially around my teenage years is when I think as kids we all look similar. There is besides the markers that maybe your parents dress you a certain way, or you probably grow your hair, which I didn't. My mother fairly allowed me to. My parents allowed me to my own devices in terms of choosing my clothes on a daily basis and things like that. And even the way I wore my hair short. So I think the incident that we had discussed earlier was that once I was just running an errand for my mother, and I used to cycle up and down, and I just moved to a smaller city from a bigger city where I'd grown up earlier. And I was quite new to the place and still getting used to the culture and things like that. And I remember some kid, probably my age, a little plus or minus 1 or 2 years, stopping me on the way, and they were like in the local language in Tamil. They were like, "Are you a boy or are you a girl?" And it really took me back. I was just like, what is this question? And why am I being asked this question? And what does it mean if I say in this situation? I had always been told I was a girl, and I just assumed that I was a girl. So at that point, if I had said, no, I'm a boy, then what changes? Like, what was this person expecting? And if I had said I'm a girl, would this person be disappointed in me, or like, I don't know, how would that have shaped their perception or approach to me, right? So similarly, I think throughout my teenage years, I've had a lot of similar incidents where I didn't feel like I fit, where I was told like, "Hey, what are you doing? Girls don't do that." So, but I'm told that I am a girl,
Right.
and I'm like, if I'm a girl and I do that, that means girls do that,
Yeah.
There was always that tension, I feel, that in the way others perceived me
Right.
and the way I kind of was.
Okay. Okay. And what about the kind of autistic self that you had?
Yeah,
How
yeah.
did that kind
So yeah, I remember, like, I think with in my autistic self was just that I did not see myself like I did not see myself fitting into any of these binaries. And these binaries, I felt like everybody else got that. They understood it. It was like a open secret. Like everybody else understood how this gender thing worked and how they fitted into it and how they should be, so that gender was like understood, their gender identity was understood the way they wanted it. Whereas for me, I was just like, I don't understand this. What is supposed to happen, you know? So there was a lot of confusion around it. And it was a very social confusion. Like, I'm not getting the social cues. And when I talked to people about it, it seemed very matter of factly to them. They were just like, "Ye kaisa question hai? Ya kya baat kar rahe ho?" You know? And I'm just like, legitimately, मेरे को समझ में नहीं आ रहा है. Like, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do and why I was even asked this question. And
Right.
am I supposed to feel offended? Am I supposed to feel unsafe? What is the appropriate reaction to being asked such a question by an absolute stranger?
Right.
Right?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's where my autistic self, like, I really felt like I'm not offended by the question, but I'm really confused as to what the significance of that question means.
Right. So when was it that do you remember? I mean, when was it that you discovered that you were non-binary and autistic? I mean, when was it like some sort of gradual understanding, or was it like some sort of aha moment? How did it kind of happen for you?
I think in some sense I always knew, but I didn't have the vocabulary for it. It was only in my mid-20s that I met another friend of mine, a very close friend of mine at this point, but we had just met at then. And they told me that they were trans. And I was asking, okay, so what are your pronouns? And I thought they were he, him. But they were like, no, I use they, them, and they, their pronouns.
Right.
So I was curious. I was just like, I did not really understand the non-binary identity at that point as a theory.
Right.
But so when they told me about it, it felt very natural to me. I was just like, that makes so much sense that you do not feel like you're neither a man nor a woman. And
Right.
this whole idea of a yeah, and there's also this idea of man or a woman being adults and a boy or a girl means kid,
Yeah.
like a kid. And I have always like identified more with the word girl, to be honest, than being seen as a woman.
Right.
Things like that. And there are non-binary identities like demi girl, demi boy, and I feel like I would probably enter the demi girl. So it was like a whole video game world had opened up to me, a whole video game universe had opened up to me, and I
Right.
was just like, I can finally pick the character that I want to play, you know, and I can maybe change it up if I want to, if I'm not feeling like the powers are suiting me or like all of that. So that's when it was only in my mid-20s that I got my vocabulary. But even as a kid, I remember reading like Famous Five and really relating to George so much that I used to talk about George so much that my uncle actually used to call me George. And he made a joke about how I should be King George and stuff. And I felt very affirmed in that moment. I'm just like, I like this. I like that they're not being pushed into one box and be like, you cannot be George, you know, you have to be like Annie or something like that.
Yeah.
So
That's amazing.
yeah,
That's really amazing. And I love what you said about the video game kind of character, because it's
yeah,
actually really like that you get to pick and choose.
yeah,
And I think the beauty
yeah,
of the world that we are gradually kind of entering is we're giving people the ability
yeah,
to kind of pick and choose in that sense, and
yeah, yeah,
there is, while of course there is, a lot of kind of prejudice and
mm.
phobia around it, there is also a celebration.
Hostility.
And
Yeah,
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 and that is a wonderful thing. So, I
mm.
discovered a very interesting statistic. So I'm going to
Mm.
quote from this article I read, and it says people who do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth are 3 to 6 times as likely to be autistic as cisgender people are, according to this huge study. And it goes on to say gender diverse people are also more likely to report autism traits and to suspect they have undiagnosed autism. 5% of
Mm.
cisgender people in the study had autism, whereas 895 or 24% of the gender diverse people did. So again, why is this something? Because this is something I've read all over, and it's something. So what do you think is the reason for this?
I think the reason, as far as autism goes, is just that for me, it seems like gender is a social construct, and it is not really explained to you. It is a very, like I said, it's like an open secret. Everybody pretends that they know what's going on, or maybe they do. But for an autistic person, it seems like there are some very valid questions to be asked. For instance, like um, sometimes I like growing my hair, and sometimes I like just getting rid of it. And for me, it's a very it's a stimulatory issue. Like
Right.
sometimes I just feel like, I remember this one time when I just looked at a picture of me and I was like, that person does not look like what I'm feeling like, you know. And I just cut my hair off like that day. I went to the salon and just cut it off. And for some people, and I sometimes I'm also like, you know, it's all around me, you know, it's all around my neck, and it's, you know, it's really, and when I'm washing my hair, there's just so much going on. Becomes very overstimulating. And yeah, and people don't really understand that issue. They're just like, no, but you're a woman. And once when I shaved my head off, it became a huge thing. They were like, women shouldn't shave their head. And I was just like, I wanted space, you know, and I wanted to clear it up. So there are these innate like social fabric issues that are very hard to really understand, because they come from many different beliefs and ideas that people don't really explain but just follow as a rule, I guess. I don't know. They don't really question it. But with an autistic person, I think they start questioning it. They don't question the social rule as much as they question it, the fitability of that rule for themselves, at least for me.
Right.
So I think that's where that's the kind of thinking pattern that really leads to a lot of autistic people also questioning their gender identity and gender expression as well.
That's really interesting, because I remember when we were originally talking, when we spoke, and I was telling you about how I thought that people who were autistic would see the world as binary, and you kind of corrected me and said that no, actually that's not the case. So this is a really
Yeah,
interesting kind of point of view.
yeah,
My
yeah,
perspective was something completely different, but yeah, thank you for this. You know, and another thing that
yeah.
we talked about was also about consent. And I saw
Hmm.
this lovely piece that you had created, which talks about
Yeah,
consent, and how, you know, that where somebody who is on the spectrum and in a relationship with somebody might want to, you know, kind of need some space, or may not want to be touched in a particular way, or something which
yeah.
another, or may just want space to just sit and be quiet. Their partner,
Hmm.
on the other hand, might take this as rejection, or
Yeah.
you know, that the person is unhappy with them. When this comes to sexual relationships and consent, it again becomes very nuanced.
Hmm.
So how does this happen in terms with when in neurodivergence, where
Yeah.
the whole concept of consent, how does it work? What have you seen?
Hmm. Interestingly, just yesterday or a couple of days ago, there's this other sexual wellness platform called Sangya,
Right,
where someone with ADHD had also written about Sangya Project. Someone with ADHD had written about how they approach sex, and how sometimes they feel like initially they're really curious about sex and they really want to go into it, but they suddenly disconnect from their body, or they lose interest in sex,
right,
you know, right in the middle of the act. So the other person might see this as rejection, or they might see this as being very flaky, or them not being interested in the other person and things like that. So I think that's where I feel like, as an autistic person, I also really relate to my asexuality. My identity as an asexual and aromantic, because asexuality finally opened up this idea for being demisexual, for
okay, so
being
sorry to interrupt.
sapiosexual,
So if you
where
explain to people, I'm sorry to interrupt, what is
yeah,
asexual and what is aromantic, just so that people
yeah,
don't know
yeah.
what the terms are.
Yeah, so asexuality and aromanticism are both spectrums. Asexuality means where you don't feel a sexual attraction, or you feel rarely a sexual attraction.
Okay,
Aromantic means aromantics are people who rarely feel romantic attraction, or sometimes, or never feel it,
okay,
right? So yeah, that's another thing. People, when they say, "Oh, you don't feel romantic attraction," that means you don't have libido. That means you don't want to have sex, which is not true. Same way for aromantics also. Just because you don't feel romantic attraction, or you feel it rarely, doesn't mean you don't want to pursue a romantic relation. That's not the case. We still have those, you know, we're still curious about what romantic relationships are like. We're still curious about what sexual relationships are like, and we still want what these relationships offer, which may be sex, a certain form of caregiving, a certain form of companionship, partnership. All of these things, we are still human. We're just saying that we're not feeling that attraction the way it is described in media, or the way you're feeling it, right? So, and they're both spectrums. So within the asexuality, aromanticism spectrum, there are these identities like demisexual, which means you need to first have an emotional bond, emotional connection with someone before you experience sexual attraction, right? Or before you pursue sexual relationships with them. And sapiosexual means you need to have some sort of an intellectual bond, an intellectual connection before you feel like you can communicate your ideas with this person and you feel like it's received well before you have a sexual or romantic relationship with them. So these were very interesting for me. I actually, before I knew my gender identity or before I knew that I was bisexual, I actually knew that I was asexual. I realized that I don't feel this kind of, and aromantic. I realized that I don't feel this kind of attraction to people the way other people do, you know?
Right.
So, yeah. So my dating life was also not happening in that sense and things like that. So I think these are certain identities which really help autistic people kind of relate to how, at least for me, how we relate to relationships in a way which might be non-hierarchical, where a romantic partner does not necessarily mean they are, you know, more interesting or more important to you than, let's say, a friend, you know. That's an idea where yeah. So there is at least for me, I expect all my romantic partners present and past to really be my friend first, you know, like get to know me. And if, as a friend, if I just told you that, hey, I think I need to cancel today, can we do this another day? Can we hang out another day? You wouldn't feel that bad. But with romantic rejection, I feel like there is this, it's really loaded. When I say I can't make it for the day today, they feel stood up, you know, and whereas this might be a first date or a second date, I'm like, investment is so low, you barely know me for 2 months. Why do I have to suddenly show up for you in this capacity that I might not even show up for somebody I've known for longer, right? So does that answer your question?
It does. No,
Yeah.
and it's actually very interesting because so I remember my first chat was with a young man who's on the spectrum, and he used a very cute line where he says friendship is for me is like the Western Ghats and romantic relationships are like Mount Everest. Okay, which means that pressure
builds on it.
Builds, you know, I mean, it's like this insurmountable feat that this, like, you know, to have a romantic relationship with someone while neurodivergent, autistic, is so difficult. It's like akin to climbing Mount Everest. Now, when you talk about it like in this respect, it's much easier for the person because it kind of really lowers expectations, it lowers pressures, and it lets the neurodivergent person be who they are, in a sense.
Instead of having this pressure of romance. And another thing I wanted to point out is a lot of times sexual relationships are also conflated with being romantic relationships, you know. It's like they say friends with benefits, but friendship already has benefits. You know, so what are these extra benefits that you're talking about, and why do they have to be benefits? Like a lot of times when I talk to people, for me, for instance, sex is not necessarily romantic. It can be, but it's also like play. It's just playtime. You're discovering another person's body and how they feel, you know, and we're constantly communicating, and that's the fun of it. That's what makes it joyful, you know. But most people don't see it this way, and there's also this idea that when you have sex, it has to be, you know, like magic, and it has to have that
playing,
it has to be fully charged and everything like that. And that sort of thing, I feel like builds up over time as you get to know the other person. I mean, sometimes you might have that kind of chemistry. I'm not denying it, but most times you probably don't. And sex with different people can feel different ways, and it can be beautiful in different ways, and it can be nice in different ways. And in fact, when I've talked about this idea of sex as an erotic play, a lot of people have shared with me about how their first erotic experiences were when they were kids, you know, even earlier than they were teenagers, where they were playing, you know, with their friends, house, ghar, whatever, role playing, and the other person like touched them in a certain way, regardless of the gender, and they were like, you know, feeling a certain way, where they're feeling charged or they're feeling heightened emotions or, you know, an attraction. And that's the beauty of it. Children know that, you know, each other's word. And if you push someone away, most children don't impose them. They're like, okay, I'm sorry. It's what they've shared. And I'm like, why can't we still be that way? Why can't we just be curious about one another and see where the other person wants to go based on communication or like even non-verbal communication, and then just respond accordingly. Like, so yeah.
So I want to ask you another question based on what you just said, where you talked about communication. Now, again,
Yeah.
communication for a lot of people with autism is difficult, right?
It's challenging.
Yes, challenging, it's difficult. And communication is not just like a flat line. It's layered. There are so many nuances. How
Yeah.
that personally kind of, um, worked for you, in the sense, how have you been able to deal with the challenges of this multi-nuanced verbal, non-verbal communication when it comes to your relationships? Again, and I'm bringing in again the two, like, being neurodivergent, being queer. How is it
Yeah.
working?
Yeah. Um, I don't know if I've been dealing with it great, because like I'll tell you some of the challenges that I've had. I remember sometime I was friends with someone and we were kind of seeing each other, and then I told them that I see us deepening this. I see that I have stronger feelings for you, and I see us deepening this relationship. And they just said, "Oh, so do you want a relationship?" And in my head, I was just like, "Don't we already have one?"
Yeah,
You know,
right.
a friendship is a relationship. All sorts of equations are a relationship. All I'm saying is, I would like to deepen. I want to know where you're at. And similarly, there's this idea, there's this relationship escalator that if I tell you I have feelings for you, instead of you sharing that you have feelings for me or you don't feel the same way, the idea is that, okay, now we have to date, or now we have to have a relationship. And I'm like, let's figure that out together now. Let's see what dating means for us. So there are a lot of these implicit coded words that we have, like a relationship obviously means a romantic monogamous relationship. A serious relationship obviously means you're being exclusive, monogamous.
Right.
Things like that. It's very coded. And yeah, it's really hard to, I think, make sense of it because you don't necessarily see it that way. Like, who said, I mean, you have to understand the context of it suddenly, because then the context matters. If this person says relationship in this particular context, then I have to now, a switch needs to go on and say, oh, they mean romantic relationship, exclusive, monogamous, things like that. So
Yeah.
I think that's where.
So that's interesting, because I mean, I guess that part of your brain, or that part, like you said, it's like you have to switch. You have to like literally put on a switch and say, okay, this is how I need to start thinking now.
Masking. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
asking, exactly. That's what you're doing. And that, from everything I've read and from people I've spoken to, that adds tremendous pressure.
Immense pressure.
It really compromises your own mental health, right?
It does.
What do you have to say about that?
It does, and which is why it's really nice if a person spends time with you to really understand and not put you on the spot and say, give me that time and space to articulate myself. Or like yesterday, I was trying to articulate something to a friend, and I was just like, give me a second, let me just, create the thought in my head first before I can articulate it, because before I say that. And masking, like you just asked me, masking really affects your mental health because I feel not good enough. I'm like, I'm not good enough. I need to grow to kind of show up in this relationship, whereas my authentic self is not enough. I feel like I'm being put through a test. When I actually have developed a lot of trust issues around this. Whenever there is whenever a partner says, no, this is not going to work for me, or a potential partner or someone says it's not going to work for me, I feel like they're saying, no, the way you are, it's not good enough for me, you know? So it kind of brings up my trust issues, puts up my wall. And I hate that, I really would like to trust people more and myself more, but I'm not able to do that because of these kinds of issues where I feel the pressure to mask. And now that I know what masking is, having, worked on that through therapy and other things, I don't want to mask in-person relationships because they're supposed to be intimate. I want to show up as my authentic autistic self.
Right.
So that's one way which affected me. And another thing that I shared before was that I did a piece on someone last year, and that's when that set the ball rolling for my own diagnosis as well. And they are autistic, and they talked about how people don't affect their boundaries. Or a lot of times when I'm sharing a boundary, like I say, people might find my boundaries quirky, or they find it non-typical, and they just like, ये कैसा boundary है, हमको समझ में नहीं आता, ये कौन ऐसा boundary कौन रखता है, ये normal नहीं है. And that is so weird because I'm just like, I am telling you, I'm being so vulnerable and I'm saying that this is the boundary for me. It might be something as simple as don't touch my bag,
Right.
or it might be something like, like at home, for instance, I have a rule where I'm just like, you can borrow anything, any vegetable from me, you can't touch my onions. So yeah, it is funny, I get it, but in my head, I'm just like,
Right.
onions are the basis for all my food, and it needs to be there. If it
Right.
gets over, then things like that. So there is probably logic to it in my head, but I don't need to explain it to everyone. I would just like that boundary to be respected, and a
Right.
lot of times the boundaries are not respected. So you start questioning yourself, and you start thinking, oh, maybe this is not a real boundary. Maybe this is not a boundary, even though I want it. Maybe it's not a real want, and you start
Right.
compromising on them.
Yes.
It leads to a lot of abusive situations,
Yes.
sexually and otherwise.
Yes.
Your boundaries are constantly violated, and then people tell you that you have boundary issues. But yeah, you do have boundary issues. But where is it stemming from? It's stemming from constantly being invalidated.
Yeah.
So
Very
yeah,
true. Thank you so much. You've been unbelievably honest and vulnerable, and I mean, I'm just so blown away by the way you kind of reframed things. It's made me think about a lot of things. So thank you so
I'm so
much
glad.
for being
Thank you.
so honest and for sharing so much, and for taking out the time to really be here. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much for holding this space, Gopika. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.